Welcome, everyone. Today I have joining me Rosamond McKitterick, Professor Emerita of Medieval History at Cambridge University, Sydney Sussex College. Rosamond was educated well, she did her first degree at the University of Western Australia before moving back to England, where she was born, and finished her PhD under the supervision of Walter Ullmann. She also worked with Bernard Bischoff in Munich. She was first She continued her academic career at Cambridge, first at Newnham College, and then later on, when I was there, moved to Sydney Sussex College, where she remains and where, in fact, she is today. And she is, well, her list of many, many accomplishments and publications and students would take up the rest of the video, but she's the author of many books, perhaps most famously, The Carolingians and the Written Word from 1989, but also many others, and a enormous long list of articles and chapters. She was the editor of the second volume of the New Cambridge Medieval History in 1995. More recently, she has worked on the history of the early medieval papacy, publishing a book in 2020 on the Liber Pontificalis. She joins me today to talk about her life, professional, but also some personal. So thank you very much for joining me, Rosamond, and agreeing to talk to me.
Thank you, Richard. It's very lovely to see you anyway.
And I wanted to start off by asking a few questions about long ago. And, you know, we are historians, so we believe that the things long ago can have interesting implications. I was wondering if you could tell me about your parents, about maybe how the sort of context of your childhood, how they encouraged you, what they did, what they thought of your interests, that sort of thing. What role they played in what you later became.
Right. Well, it's probably best to start with the year of my birth, just as a fact. I'm born in 1949, but I was the youngest of three children. My elder sister was 8 years older, my brother 5 years older. Those two were born in the war. And my parents met at the beginning of the war because my father, who had been studying at Cambridge, had only just arrived in his first year, then joined the army when war broke out and was stationed, as far as we know, first in Belfast. And that's where he met my mother. My mother was the daughter of an electrician who worked at the dockyards and, in fact, was one of the fitters for the sister ship to the Titanic. But they met simply because my mother was working in what was then called the ATS, and my father met her. They fell in love very fast, got married very quickly, as one did in wartime. But one of the points of that is that my father was then away for the rest of the war doing, we're not sure what. He was in intelligence. His last stationing was in Southeast Asia, in fact, but we think before that he'd been in perhaps Norway at the beginning, North Africa, other places for all we know. And my sister and brother, therefore, were the product of leaves that he'd had back in Britain. My mother spent most of the war in Northern Ireland on the coast in a little village called Cushendun. And then after the war, when my father came back, he had changed completely in terms of his interest. He had read classics when he was first starting in Cambridge, and he changed to theology and then trained for the priesthood. Then became a curate at the town of Chesterfield, Church of the Crooked Spire, and that's where I was born and where I was christened. But very soon after that, he moved to a chaplaincy in Magdalen College, Cambridge. So essentially, my earliest memories are Cambridge, and we lived there until I was 7 years old. And then my father, it was a 5-year job, and in those days, 5 years was 5 years, very strictly. And he decided to apply for a new post as the director of a newly established, well, I think it would probably be fair to say, a theological college that was going to be established because my father had been appointed to do it. And what we did was to go out to Australia as £10 POMs. And therefore we went in a migrant ship with 2,000 other people, men and women segregated, 5-year journey on the ocean. We had to go around the Cape of Good Hope because the Suez Canal was closed, and arrived in Fremantle in October 1956. According to my parents, and this is relevant to subsequent history, I announced as soon as I saw Fremantle Dock and the sheep shed where all the migrants were processed that I was going to save up in my piggy bank to go home. And I'm afraid that I'm one of the categories of failed migrants, of the 25% of people who are migrated to Australia under the £10 POM scheme and then went home again. I wasn't particularly happy at school, but I have to say my undergraduate years were very happy and interesting. My father and my mother, as you can probably guess from so far, my mother was incredibly intelligent, but she had had to leave school early. She was one of 6 children. She then went to work in a factory in order to earn money, essentially pocket money for her brothers. But when war broke out, and of course she married my father, her life changed completely. And she moved to England first and then moved back to Ireland for the duration of the war. But later in life, she learnt New Testament Greek. She tried Russian, but got depressed by the literature. So she tried Hebrew, but she didn't think that was quite the thing. She was learning it from my father and ended up learning Japanese and teaching in a Japanese school for children in Australia, and enjoyed it enormously. And she taught herself French. I mean, she was very gifted, so that the two of them knew what it was to do things with one's brain. But my sister was the clever one in the family. She read classics at university, and then my brother was a chemist and organic chemist. My sister got married very young and then stopped academic work completely, but she returned to academic life and became in the end a lecturer in classics. So we were a family, and my father, because of his background, just assumed that one went to university, one studied. I was surrounded by books. It was normal to read, and I was very happy at home. I survived school because I was very happy at home. So the influence, I think, was just encouragement. Whatever I was going to do, I was encouraged to do it. But I have to say I wasn't expected to do very much because, as I say, my sister was the clever one. So it was probably, looking back, I probably had a certain amount of freedom. But I think my sister and I used to talk about how lucky we were that our father just assumed we would do whatever we could, and whatever we were able to do, we could do. The fact that we were female was neither here nor there. And I think we were really, really lucky in retrospect, especially in Australia in the 50s and 60s, which is a fairly male chauvinist society in those days, that we never, ever had any suspicion that there was something that we couldn't do. When we got to university, both of us thought, well, what's all this nonsense about? And then because of the strength of our background, just ignored it. And I think that's something that's been a factor most of my life. If you find people with silly attitudes towards women, then that's their problem, not yours.
And I think that, there were a fair few female trailblazers at Cambridge, even, before the war, like Eileen Power, for instance, that may have already normalized that, at least for people like your father who would have known about them. That's very interesting. Lovely answer. And it really allows me to go straight into what would be my next question, which is whether there was a moment or a time or something that signaled to you that you wanted to study history or medieval history specifically, and whether you can remember something that made you realize that this was the path for you.
I don't think it's ever been a path that I've recognized. One thing has always led to another. But certainly when I was at school, when I was very young, I read historical fiction, Rosemary Sutcliffe's books, Helen Waddell, Peter Abelard, I remember reading when I was 14 and being totally horrified by the story. I had to look up what castration was, and then was even more horrified because I hadn't realized. But it led me straight to the history books to find out how much was true. So that when it came to applying for university, I wanted to read medieval history, but that was just that step. I hadn't thought further about it. It was the case, however, that in the university library in Western Australia, on the third floor, as you went up to find the MGH and other history books, they had big flat shelves on which were big grey volumes. And one day I thought, I wonder what these are, picked it up and put the first one was Codices Latini Antiquiores, Volume 1. And I was 17 years old and opened this up. And here was this person saying he knew that a book was written in North Africa or in England or in Spain or in Italy simply because of the letter forms. I got completely fascinated even then by letter forms, and always was then looking out for anything I could learn about manuscripts and paleography. The development of something as concrete as wanting to study further was really into my third and fourth years as an undergraduate, when it became a possible ambition. I wanted to go back to England, I've said that before, and that was always my goal. I was going to re-emigrate as fast as I could. I didn't do it to study in my first degree because I thought it would be too young to leave my family, especially if I had no intention of coming back again. So I thought after the first degree. And essentially, I did apply to other universities. Well, I wrote inquiring letters to other universities as an undergraduate, but Oxford was very sniffy. I wrote to Walter Ullmann, and he wrote me an incredibly kind, encouraging letter back, this strange letter from nobody on the other side of the world. And he was extraordinarily welcoming. And it's important to register that simply because initially he was so encouraging. And then while I was an undergraduate, I still remember the moment when my professor looked at me after he'd read an essay of mine, and he said, "I think you're going to get a first." And it's at that point I thought, this ambition isn't so stupid. Perhaps I'm going to make it. So I just kept working, and I did win the one scholarship for which I was eligible as a British passport holder and not an Australian citizen. All the others were for Australians. And so I managed to re-emigrate and came back to England and arrived in September 1971.
Well, that perfectly introduces the next thing I wanted to ask, which was you'd been in Australia for 12, 13, 14 years. And what was it like to come back to some place that you'd known when you were 7 to study. And I suppose, I mean, I don't know whether your accent had changed, how people treated you. What was it like, the reintegration process from Australia to Cambridge?
Well, oddly enough, Richard, I was coming home.
Hmm.
That's how I thought of it. We still had friends in Cambridge. We had not very much family because the family was scattered all around the place, but friends of my parents, not my own friends, but friends of my parents. And I was so thrilled to be back in Cambridge. And my first day, after I basically unpacked, got up, I went for a walk, found my way to my old school, and I could find my way around. And then I went to see Walter. So essentially, I can't remember feeling like a fish out of water at all. There were obvious differences, but I was just relishing it. So very happy. I now understand when people get off an aeroplane or a boat and kiss the ground. So, and it was just wonderful.
That's great because I have to say that uh, now when I go back to where I was from, to Kingston, um, uh, it's been a lot longer since I lived there. But there is always this feeling that this I don't belong here anymore. So it's good that, but that's also a feature of getting older. The older you get, the more you feel like the world has changed rather than when you were 20, you're still moving along with the world. Um,
Yeah.
the
I mean, I must say, when I went our first visit back to Australia after a long period, I thought, this is nothing to do with me. I had a period of my life here, but I don't belong here. So it was
okay,
in reverse, really.
that's interesting. Um, Now, you mentioned Walter Ullman twice
Mhm.
already, and that is the substance of my next question. So, uh, I was reading Walter Ullman's The Carolingian Renaissance, and the Nature of Kingship, the from 1968, 69. And reading that first sort of introductory chapter in his book, um, and it uh, it was very interesting because it was sort of in embryo, what a lot of, it laid some of the groundwork for the work that you would later do, and uh, Jinty and others, uh, sort of an idea of what is going on in the Carolingian period that I thought was kind of prescient. Um, and uh, he wasn't super interested in the questions that you came to be interested in, but you could see some of the jumping off points in his work. Um, but you've also told me that you had a difficult relationship with Walter Ullman as a supervisor, supervisee. So I was wondering if you could talk to me about how you worked with Walter, how you found him as a supervisor, whether the my impression that there was sort of a tension between you was true, that sort of thing.
Well, at first, as I've said, he was incredibly encouraging, and he was meticulously attentive to my work and actually the work of all his students. He used to have what he called the colloquium, which was every fortnight. Only his students were called to this, and we had to report on progress, take it in turns. And this became increasingly an ordeal for many of us. the difficulties arose because he really regarded us as Schüler in the old Austrian tradition. So we were disciples who would carry on the work of the master. And when we started to deviate from a path, or at least as far as he was concerned, deviate, then there would be trouble. And all the students of Walter experienced this. I think one or two exceptions, but nearly all of us fell out with him in one way or another, some more seriously than others, simply because of this attitude. So it was a strange mixture. I ought to interject that I don't think being female was either here or there.
Mhm.
Most of the time, I don't think he even noticed. It wasn't a matter of interest to him. So that was not an issue, though I think Ginty felt that it was for her. But then she's that much older than I, and maybe he had changed a bit. So essentially, the troubles arose when I started to produce the chapters of my thesis, and he simply didn't understand or appreciate or like even the direction it was going. And the questions I was asking, he liked, but he didn't like the way I was seeking to answer them with the work on all the particular source categories and the rest of it. So essentially, for the last year and a half of my thesis, he didn't speak to me at all. And I went off to Munich anyway, decided that I would simply take advantage of the latitude of the timing for submission of a PhD and spend the 4th year of my PhD, when I should have submitted after 3, but I had the 4-year leeway to spend my time in Munich. Fortunately for me, we fell out after I had already been elected to a junior research fellowship at Newnham, and he'd written the reference for me, because if it had happened in another way, that might not have worked out. But it did mean that when I went to my viva, which instead I've just had the 50th anniversary of my PhD viva last week, I then was going to find out whether or not he was right or I was. And fortunately for me, my examiners thought my work was worthwhile and passed it. And it was then subsequently published fairly rapidly in Geoffrey Elton's new series. So I was very lucky in that respect, with the Royal Historical Society taking that on board. The relationship didn't improve. I mean, he would cut me dead in the street. But then Peter Linehan, who was another research student, former one of Walter, realized that, well, he just knew because he'd been through roughly the same kind of thing. And he organized Walter's Festschrift and asked me and Ginty whether we would contribute. We both said yes, because we felt we owed him an enormous amount, and we did, both of us. So we contributed our articles. We went to the festive lunch. And then afterwards, I got a letter from Walter saying, I really liked your chapter, come and talk to me. And so before his death, we were actually reconciled. And I'm thankful for that, because I did owe him a lot. It was a very difficult time when basically somebody is criticizing you so forcefully, and they may be right and you might be wrong. But one thing it did teach me was that I should never, ever treat one of my research students like that, to insist that they should think like me, to insist that they should write like me, to insist that they should do their work in the same way that I would, and give them freedom. Of course, keep an eye on things that they might, miss or not think about, but to give them much more intellectual freedom than I might have had if I'd really. I don't think my thesis would have been any good at all if I tried to do it Walter's way, because I just didn't think like him. I'm very interested that you think there are elements of his work that I built on. That's a really interesting observation. Certainly, that book was one of the ones I read. When I've read it subsequently, I just don't believe it. But when I remember reading it when I was an undergraduate and thinking that this was an exciting field, partly because, and it was one of the reasons I became an early medievalist, there were quite clearly so many different interpretations possible. so many avenues you could explore, and indeed so much that hadn't yet been exploited. And in my first year as a research student, when he sent me off to, what he wanted me to do was a thesis about the origins of criminal law, and sent me off to the penitentials as a possible source of material that would enable me to elucidate the origins of criminal law. When I came back after 6 months and said, I can't do a thesis on the penitentials, they're in a total mess, they needed re-editing, and I didn't know that Kocher was actually in the process of a major research project at that stage, re-editing them indeed. So, but I did have the alternative, which ended up as my thesis, and at that stage Walter was very, very encouraging. But the notion that one should set a topic for somebody and then they should jolly well do it is not something I think I would encourage. There's things you could suggest. You might be interested in doing this, or have you thought about X and Y, but not being too doctrinaire about it.
In our case, I seem to recall that I had an idea that I would continue on doing. No, I would go back to something because I'd written my master's thesis on Northern Italy, and I said, well, no, I want to go back to something about England and France, or England and Francia earlier than the Carolingians. And you said, well, why not just continue on with Carolingian Northern Italy, but wider? And I thought, oh, well, yeah, that makes more sense. But it was a suggestion, and a helpful one at that. So I'm glad to hear that about Walter Ullmann. I think that I always had sort of a very shaky grasp of that relationship from snippets and bits. I think that it's interesting reading his work because I feel like at the time that he was writing, the Carolingians were not particularly popular. So he was in a certain way showing the interest of looking at them. One of my students was reading Jacques Le Goff's The Intellectuals of the Middle Ages, or from 58 or 57. It was very, very, very negative, the Carolingians. So that pivot that you and Ginty and others helped to bring about, you can sort of see the very first little bits of that with his work. It's also interesting that he worked on the Carolingians as well as on the papacy, and it's something that you've also done. Now, Walter was a big influence, both positive and negative, and it's made you a better research supervisor. But I was wondering whether you could talk about a colleague, and not necessarily a medievalist, who's had influence on you or your work. Another historian, for instance, or a classicist, or it could be a medievalist, but just anybody who you feel is not necessarily somebody who works on the same thing as you, but who has taught you something.
Well, I think it would be Kathleen Hughes. She was my colleague when I came to Newnham as a research fellow. She was a remarkable woman, incredibly hardworking and very, very focused on critical appraisal and reappraisal of the material she worked on, which was mostly to do with early medieval Ireland. We had many, many conversations because we became close friends. I think the most impressive element for me in terms of influence was her attitude to teaching, and how she would often spend a whole summer preparing for the next year's teaching to make sure she was up to date. And the scrupulousness of teaching something when you know about it, and not doing it unless you do know about it, was, I think, a very, very important lesson to learn. I had had quite a lot of experience of teaching, oddly enough, before, because in the 6 months that intervened before my taking up my scholarship in Cambridge, the Australian academic year being the other way up, as it were, I actually was appointed as a temporary tutor, which is the same as an assistant professor, for that year while people were on leave. And I had 60 students divided into 6 seminars, and I also had to give lectures, and I had to teach early medieval Europe from 900 to 1500, and early modern Europe and intellectual history for the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. So I was desperately trying to keep abreast of all this new stuff, often only a week ahead of my students. I still remember teaching political thought, and while they were still reading Hobbes, I was on to Spinoza. But Kathleen's the whole determined, comprehensive approach, as well as her own scholarship, were very, very important. I read her work, and it was, in fact, the first book I edited was the memorial volume for her, because she had a stroke and died at the age of 50. It was a catastrophic loss, I think, for scholarship, but for a lot of people personally, because her gift of friendship was terrific. She too had a wicked sense of humor, and was a very, very brilliant mimic. Once you could get her mimicking things, she was very, very funny.
And that's I knew about that volume, but I didn't know, I hadn't remembered the context. So that's wonderful. Now people can approach that volume with that background. And I guess a follow-on question is, since Kathleen Hughes, well, I'm not sure whether you would call her a medievalist or not, but whether you could talk maybe about your most admired medievalist, or somebody that you admire. It doesn't have to be somebody who you necessarily met. So you could say Bernhard Bischoff, but you could also say you could also say Marc Bloch. I mean,
yeah, him too. Leopold de Lille.
Yeah.
Lo, though I don't think he was a very nice man, but he was a very, very good scholar. And he did write, he had the idea for Codices Latini Antiquiores, which is just an extraordinary thing to have thought of and then brought to fruition. But Bernhard Bischoff was, it was a wonderful year I had in Munich studying with him. It's not, he was a desperately shy man, so it's not that one got to know him particularly well, but I've still got a great pile of letters from him that we exchanged letters over the years. And when he came to Cambridge for his honorary degree, he actually came out to supper with us. And this was when my daughter was 6 weeks old. He and his wife insisted on meeting her, and so brought downstairs. So I could tell Lucy that she has held the hand of Bernhard Bischoff, who had held the hand of Paul Lehmann, who had held the hand of Ludwig Trauber, who probably knew Leopold de Lille. So these are the great scholars, and one admires their scholarship and all that they have done, really, to make sure that knowledge survives and understanding develops and grows.
And there's a great article about, it's mainly about Bernhard Bischoff, in fact, but it's the retrospective written by Bengt Lufsted, where he talks about being in Bischoff's seminar in Munich, and how Bischoff, they were all puzzling over a fragment about what the text might be, and Bernard Bischoff looked at the fragment and said, "Oh, it's this commentary by Augustine on this," and he pulled down the PL volume and opened the page to the right verse, and it was that even Bengt Lofsted was in awe of his abilities. It was quite telling. Now I'm going to switch from talking about people to talking about places. And I wanted to know, you've held many different visiting positions. I was wondering whether there's one that stands out for you.
I think it's NIAS, the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Study. I had a full year there, 2005 to 6, part of a research group organized by Maaike de Jong. And Maaike has been absolute wonderful stalwart friend and sounding board for decades. But she organized a little group, and we were all at NIAS together. And then NIAS was based at Wassenaar, which is essentially a fairly well-heeled village between Den Haag and Leiden on the coast. That's where I wrote the Charlemagne book. I finished off the Perceptions of the Past book, and I also wrote 3 articles. So it was an incredibly fruitful year, but it was just deeply enjoyable to be part of that. Jan Ziolkowski was there, Ayo van der Jacht, David Gantz, Else Rosa, Maaike herself, Joe Harris from Harvard. And the interchange with all the other people at NIAS was just deeply enjoyable. And the other thing was physical. I loved being so close to the sea. I went swimming in the sea every morning until it got too cold, and then reverted to the town pool until May, and then went back to swimming in the sea again for the rest of my time. One could cycle into Leiden and look at the manuscripts, and it was just hugely enjoyable in every respect. We also had one of the meetings of the Texts and Identities group that was flourishing at the time, actually at NIAS when we were there. And that too was just a wonderful way of sharing what we were experiencing at NIAS with all our respective students from Vienna, Leeds, Cambridge, and Utrecht. I think that was before the Paris group joined us.
I think you're right, because I was there.
Ah.
I did a paper about Agnellus of Ravenna, I think. And that was part of the reason that I, when I arrived in Cambridge in 2005, I had my MPhil was supervised by Elena Screen,
Of course.
and then moved on to being supervised by you for the PhD. So I did get to go to NIAS and see the dunes and the sea and all of that. But as I recall it, it was in the middle of the year. It was a bit foggy most of the time, but it seemed like a lovely place. Now, from places to works, could you, and I know that this is a question that everybody hates, but could you name a book of history, medieval history or other, that you particularly like? That it doesn't have to, I hate to say favorite, because it's so hard to choose a favorite, but something that is important to you, that you had an impact on you, that we would, if you had only one bookshelf, to one shelf on one bookshelf to fill with books, that would definitely be there.
Well, I've mentioned Codices Latini Antiquiores already.
Mm-hmm.
I own it. I own the whole set. Some of the volumes belong to Dorothy Whitelock, and the others have acquired gradually over the years. I would hate to lose that off my bookshelves. And it is actually something one can read and look at. Continuous prose and argument, that's much more difficult. And I should really have given probably a little bit more thought to this beforehand. I suppose I can't choose. It depends what I'm working on and what will have an impact at the moment. And some things you've read, you think, gosh, that was so good and so interesting. So I think I'm falling back on things that I find indispensable, which would be CLA and the Bischoff volumes. And maybe if something occurs to me in the course of our conversation, I might come back to that.
Okay. And I'll even be even bolder and ask, is there a work of fiction that would be on that same shelf?
Well, I mean, I've mentioned as a child reading Rosemary Sutcliffe's books. I'm very fond of reading Dickens. I like Victorian fiction. And I've read sort of the A grade and the B's and the C's even. We used to find them in lots of bookshops. But again, I think one changes one's taste slightly as one gets through, and then somebody will introduce you to a particular author. I still remember having been aware, for instance, of H.M. Prescott's The Man on the Donkey, never reading it, and then reading it and thinking, goodness me, this is a splendid book. Similarly, when The Name of the Rose first came out, everybody read it, but I think everybody also enjoyed it. I thought that was a wonderful book as well. But then there are many, many wonderful books and many wonderful authors. So I think I read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of crime fiction as well, for pleasure. I read in bed before I go to sleep. Though it tends not to be so much very, very exciting crime fiction, so then I'll dream about it. But I have always read for pleasure.
I can't remember who said this. I think it was George Crump wrote a book about history and historical method. And he said that one of the most important things is to read things that aren't histories, because it plays out in how you write, your facility with words and expression. And that's clearly been the case with you. I always tell my students that it's important to read outside of what exactly they're doing, because it will help them in ways they don't necessarily realize.
Well, my degree, the way this degree was structured in Australia was like the Scottish system, Scottish Highers. So one actually read 4 subjects. And I read English, Latin, philosophy, and history in my first year, and then English and history in the second, before doing the honours part for 2 years in history. So English literature was a very, very serious element of my study for a long time. And especially in the second year, when we were reading all the 17th and 18th century English literature and all the metaphysical poets. And it was just wonderfully, wonderfully, I think, inspiring, all that poetry.
I think that one of the things that I've realized in interviewing a number of people in this field is how it's interesting talking to you and hearing you say these things, because it's clear that there's such an interest in reading and learning new things that is almost melancholic a lot of the time, because everybody realizes that there's so much to know and so many interesting things to know that you can never quite do, but it's always exciting. Now, that was positive. I want to talk more negative for a second. Um, I wanted to know whether um, there was a project, uh, a research project, an idea, something to do with teaching, some ambition that you had that didn't turn out the way you'd hoped, didn't go well, didn't succeed. Pat told me a very amusing story about how he was convinced that the chronicle in northern Italy had been made up of pieces of offcuts of a tour's Bible, and he'd spent weeks measuring these fragments against the original, what he thought was the original manuscript where the offcuts supposedly came from. He spent weeks, and he had a grant to do this, and he never published any of it because it never panned out. So do you have a story like that?
I've got a story quite like that, in that when I was in Rome in 2002, I was working on the manuscripts of the Lorsch Library catalogues and spent an enormous amount of time sorting out exactly how they were structured and put together. And I thought, this would really should be edited. And then I found out, of course, that it was already being done by Angelica, I think her name, Hese. So basically, it was good for my understanding, but I didn't do anything with it. But the other thing that I failed to do, and only did a fraction of, was I was commissioned to write the history of the church in the 10th century for the Oxford series. And I did try. I tried for a number of years, but the Carolingians and the written word and history and memory kept intruding. In the end, I just thought, I'm not going to do this. So the only manifestation is the chapter I wrote in the Cambridge Medieval History, Volume 3. And in a way, that wasn't, I don't think it was as good. It's all right as a chapter. In fact, there's an awful lot that went into it that was really primary research, but I held back a bit because at that stage I still thought I was going to write the big book with all the ideas in it. In the end, I had to admit to Henry and Owen Chadwick that I wasn't going to write this. It was partly because at that stage there was so much that we simply didn't know enough about what the sources were, where they were, how to date the manuscripts. It was quite clear that there was a massive amount that should be said about the 10th century, but actually doing it just looked insurmountable. Now, of course, with work like Charles West's, or the group in Vienna, people in Tübingen, they're all working on, as it were, post-Carolingian transformation of the Carolingian world. And it's looking much more feasible, and it's actually really exciting how much they're finding out and writing and changing views both of the 9th century and the 11th as a consequence. So though I understand what they're doing, partly because of all that work, but I didn't do very much that was much use myself. Though the chapter isn't bad, it's not bad.
I've assigned that chapter many times, so it's
Good.
clearly has served a purpose. Well, thank you. I'm sorry that it didn't work out, but it did. There were some fruits, and it probably helped you along in all sorts of different ways in doing other projects. Now, I asked this question of Pat as well, this following question, and I think he sort of dodged the question. I asked him whether there was one of your works, whether an article or book, that you'd like to be remembered by. And he said that the question wasn't relevant to him because he felt that he was always writing for today, and whether if somebody's reading him in 100 years, it will be in a study of historiography and not a study of history. But I was wondering whether there was something that you particularly identify with or particularly proud of. as the way it came out, that sort of encapsulates you as a scholar?
Well, I think I agree with Pat. That's a really, really difficult one. You mentioned right at the beginning the book that I suppose a lot of people will think of is the Carolingians and the written word, which
Mhm.
I did put an enormous amount of everything I had into it. And in a way, it was a sort of doing what my thesis didn't complete and carrying on that train of thought. I am actually quite fond of history and memory as a book as well, and its offshoots, the perceptions of the past. But you also slipped in what are you proud of? And there is one article that I had an enormous amount of fun writing, and it was totally out of my usual sphere. And that was partly why I enjoyed it, and it was able to exploit one of my other interests. And that was the article I wrote about Edward Gibbon in the early medieval Europe in the 18th century, because
Mhm.
that was exploiting opera libretti and my knowledge of operas and opera music. And I had such fun writing that, and I gave it to a Handel specialist so that he could check, a musicologist, so you check hadn't been completely idiotic and said something really wrong. And the argument was actually quite simple. It was, what kind of audience would Edward Gibbon have had for his book? And it was a two-way process. The audience knew all the stories already because they'd been to the opera, and then the people going to the opera might have read Edward Gibbon. Because if you know the Handel opera repertoire and the other operas of his colleagues and the libretti that people were continually setting in the 17th and 18th centuries, the number of late Roman and early medieval protagonists is quite astonishing. So it was just enormous fun. And when I gave the paper at a conference first, then we had some Handel music as well. We had one of the duets from Ottone.
Oh,
So
well,
yeah.
that's lovely, because I mean, if you were going to choose from move from books to articles of yours, there are so many that uh, I love, that will be very hard for me to choose. One of the ones that always liked, and which is why I chose it for um, the French translation, was the one on women and literacy in the early Middle Ages, because I I've it, this my opinion doesn't really matter, but one of the things I liked about that was that it combined your deep manuscript work with the study of literacy, with the sort of iconoclastic bent that you've always had in scholarship, where everybody thinks this, well, no, and here are the manuscripts to prove it. That I just think is great. So I'm hopeful to give that article a certain posterity in the Francophone world now. I know that the students who read it in draft all loved it. Um, that's the students. That leads me to my next question. What do you feel like the students of today, of tomorrow, the graduate students of today and tomorrow, what does the future look like for medieval history? Where do you see things going? And Patrick Geary was very pessimistic. Maybe you're more positive.
Well, I think one of the things that's struck me over the last little while, looking at volumes of journals that have appeared, comments about medieval history, and just noticing what new things are coming out. I've been to 2 recent conferences, one in Edinburgh in September on the late Roman historians and their transmission, and Leeds IMC. And Leeds IMC was a tonic, bursting with young, enthusiastic, clever people from all over the world, thinking new things, thinking in new directions. And I think one thing medievalists have proved they are is incredibly adaptable, but also very, very good at searching out and thinking how new developments in scholarship can or cannot be relevant and useful for them, so that although there are fashions, as you know, globalism now, it used to be gender, they get combined, there's all kinds of other issues, but they managed to make something intellectually positive about it. And this is the young generation that are doing this, as well as the older ones. And I just think that there is a future. Came away from Leeds really thinking, gosh, the subject is going to survive. There are so many of us. The difficulty, of course, is the institutional background and context, which has become very, very difficult in many countries for very, very bad reasons, with challenges to independent thought. But I think that the medievalists in particular, because they're so used to questioning their evidence, they're so used to not knowing things and trying to work out how that particular piece of evidence can throw light on something we don't know enough about. They're so used to trying to think of the other way, the context in which something might have appeared, who is telling the truth, who isn't, if they're not, why not, that this kind of approach to scholarship, and it's not unique to medievalists, but I think medievalists are particularly good at it. We're also very, very good at operating in more than one language and thinking across cultures, which is also salutary in this world, where we are encouraging in our discipline to think beyond a very, very small group. We're not a ghetto. We're a very, very enlightened group, I think, of scholars. We really are, because we've got an intellectual curiosity, and because all our work has then been examined by people in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century, it can be abused. And our job has been to say what in this, getting us close to whatever an ideal truth might be, which we'll never achieve, but we always have to strive for it. And that's actually, classicists probably have the same kind of thing, where your work is just being studied by so many people for so many centuries. You've got to take it all on board. And that's important for us. And I think so for a future for medieval scholarship, it's how to be a good historian.
That is a very excellent summative point. I'll use the next time that I have to justify the existence of medieval history, whether with my students or my colleagues or anyone else. Now, that leads into another question that I wanted to ask, which was whether you've given this sort of theoretical background now, but whether you could give some advice to somebody who is completing his or her PhD in medieval history or just history right now.
Well, as you know, it's a tough world.
Yeah.
You have to think of jobs. Are we going to get a job which will enable us to carry on doing history, teaching it and doing research? And for a large majority of people who complete PhDs, the answer is no. They won't be able to get money, even a postdoc maybe, but after that, often there's nothing after a postdoc. And at one level, it's a tragedy, but at another level, all those skills don't have to be wasted. You can carry on doing a little bit of it. You can also transfer those skills into something that's also highly productive and useful. So I suppose what I'm really saying is go into it hoping that you're going to be as lucky as you and I have been. But it may not work out like that. But whatever you do, all those skills and all that knowledge and all that sympathy you've got for the past is going to enable you to work in whatever you do end up doing that much more effectively, and you'll probably be able to carry on reading and thinking in your own way. And some of my students have been through the stage of one postdoc, then another postdoc, then it goes. One of them has become a solicitor, but he is actually still publishing occasionally and keeping up. Another has become an opera singer, but he hasn't lost. It's not because he failed. He decided he was going to pursue the singing path and was enormously successful. And he's still thinking and reading. So you don't have to give it all up. 3, as you know, have become ministers, priests, vicars of the church, but they're still doing scholarship. One of them is a very famous numismatist with an international reputation. So that I think it's, you know, for my own career, I never planned to end up as a professor of medieval history. It was just one thing led to another that became possible, and thought, well, yes, let's see if it works. I never had to, and I've been very lucky to consider what I would have done instead. And frankly, I don't know what I would have done instead. But I was lucky I didn't ever have to think about that. But I know that a lot of people do, and it's very sad at first, and the disappointment can be dreadful if it's what you've set your heart on. But I think really the advice I would give is don't set your heart on a particular path so much that you end up being disappointed, because in one way or another, you're still going to be able to do something that you will find fulfilling, and that everybody around you will still find you a wonderful person to be with.
Absolutely. That's wonderful advice. And now for my final question. So we just talked about what you might have done had you not become a professor of medieval history. But now that you are, and you have worked in the field for, as you said, it's been 50 years since your PhD viva. If you were given another 25 years, say, to continue working on medieval history or history, what would you do? I think that would make you 101, 102, something like that. I know that
Unlikely, but not impossible. Yes.
I just saw an interview with Dick Van Dyke.
Right.
He's still going. So,
Yeah, well,
what
yes.
are your plans for the next little while?
I've got no great plans. I have, in the last little while, I've been responding to suggestions that I contribute something or other for a particular volume to a particular project, and have enjoyed those immensely, and there are more articles to come as a consequence. I've got an interest, a long-term one, in the transmission of knowledge, which involves working on manuscripts, and I will simply peg away at those and see what happens. I've got no, as it were, great grand theory at all. I'm just very interested in how people build knowledge, what they choose, why they choose it. I can't see myself moving away from late antiquity in the early Middle Ages. There's far too much work still to be done. The manuscripts are still wonderful. So I shall just keep going, I think, for as long as I'm able.
And is there another kind of history that, given another lifetime, you would be interested in exploring?
Well, when I did my discorso inaugurale for Spoleto on the Franks, which I'm very proud I managed to write in Italian with help from my Italian teacher and deliver in Italian. I worked on Balus and the whole development of French scholarship in the 17th century. And I often thought that 30 years ago, that might be a lovely retirement project. So there's a huge number of Balus manuscripts in Paris that could be exploited. But I don't think I'm going to do that now. It's probably, I've left it too late. But 17th century scholarship into the early 18th century, I do find very fascinating. And the whole context in which Balus was working and what he was trying to do. So that might be, and as I say, I did enjoy my foray into 18th century musicology enormously as well.
Well, that's it. It's too bad that we couldn't have Rosamond McKitterick doing all of these different things, because I'm sure you would have done lovely work in all in every field of history. But we have to leave some space for the others to work as well. It's been really lovely to talk to you, Rosamond, as always. And I I hope that people watching this video will come away from it with a good sense of what you're like, and your thoughts about your reflections on your own work and your career. I hope that you found it interesting to reflect on these things as well. I'm not sure how often you get solicited for these sorts of interviews, but it's always nice to have a few different questions, slightly different perspective from somebody, and have that preserved and publicized, so that people who never had the chance to meet with you can sort of see what it would be like.
Well, thank you, Richard, anyway, for talking to me and for the questions.
No problem. Okay, well, bye-bye now.